Welcome to the Flex Rental Solutions webinar. Today we're going to be starting a short series of a few weeks of reports best practices. So today we're going to cover a little bit more of the basics when it comes to things like instance level reports. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about when I say instance level reports, let me show you. There's a couple different kinds of reports that you can run in Flex. Number one, a report PDF that comes from a single specific instance. So for example, I open up this quote and I can run a report from this quote, and that would just be a PDF of whatever's on this quote. And then we also have what we call the definition level reports, and those are what are on your reports menu. These are more of reports that are running pulling a lot of information and running a report with all of that information from Flex as opposed to just from a single element like an instance level report. So let's look at some of the basics with these instance level reports, some best practices with those. And then, like I said, this will be a multi-week series, so we'll move along to some more advanced stuff with instance level reports. We'll look at some of those definition level reports, and then we'll look at a few things in terms of designing some of your own reports. Let's start by going to the Projects menu, clicking Project Elements. And since we're dealing with a quote right now, let's double-click Quote. The project elements are going to be all of the different settings for the different elements in your system. So like your quotes, pull sheets, POs, etc. So you can see all these different tabs that are these settings for our quote. And we want to go over to the Reports tab. This is going to give us all the different settings that have to do with reports for a quote. We'll look at this default print format report in just a minute, but let's start just by looking at instance level reports. One thing you may have noticed when I had my quote open here, I have about 15 or so different reports I could choose from. Now, a lot of you, especially if you haven't ventured into the project element settings for your quote, might just have one or two things listed over here. So if you want to enable more of these reports and just see what these different PDFs look like, then again, you could go to Projects, Project Elements, double-click Quote, and then go to the Reports tab where you can find instance level reports, and this is where you will check to enable any report that you want to be available from a quote. So you'll notice we have quite a few pre-built quote reports. Most of them are prefaced with the word quote so that you know that it's one that you can use. We also have just the default financial document, and then a couple other ones that can be run from a quote as well. So a few of these default look quote PDFs that we have, some of them have been around in Flex more or less since we created Flex. Some of them are a little bit newer. For example, this quote images look here is one that we recently released. If we click that, basically what this will do is just take the model image that you've uploaded to any of the inventory that's on a quote, and then it will create a PDF that looks something like this. Really useful for people that do a lot of scenic stuff or decor, and you want your clients to be able to see what they might be getting instead of just a text description. Or maybe you want to explore a couple different looks that are similar to what you get when you hit Generate PDF, but maybe you just want to see something that looks a little bit different, like this quote with pricing look D. And if we run that compared to, say, maybe quote with pricing look B, and just put those side by side, you can see there's just some subtle differences here, like the way that the header block looks is a little bit different. And then just some of the design. Looks like it's using the same fields, but there's just a little bit of design differences between the two. And so those are what instance level reports are. Those are the things that you can run from a single element, and you can control which ones are available for you to use from the Reports tab of the project element settings of whichever element you're working on. Now, I mentioned that we would look at this default print format report as well. This is something where you can get really creative with what prints when you hit Generate PDF. Because what we just showed was you can enable these different reports, and then you could just run them directly from your quote just by clicking on the name. But maybe when you hit Generate PDF, you want Flex to do certain things. Like maybe you want it to first print a cover page and then a quote look. Then maybe you want terms and conditions at the end. Maybe you even want to attach like a credit card authorization form. That's what this default print format report section will do. So I'm going to remove everything really quick and let's just start from scratch. Basically what you'll do in this section is first choose the report that you want to run. So let's say that I want a budget summary agreement look A. And then I could choose if I have a certain corporate identity chosen on a quote. I could choose which corporate identity this report would run for. So basically what that means, if I were to choose, I only want this to run when Flex Video Solutions is chosen, then if I'm on my quote and when I'm creating a quote or editing a quote, if I choose Flex Video Solutions as the corporate identity, then when I hit Generate PDF, that budget summary will run because I chose only to run with Flex Video Solutions. Now, for some people, this doesn't really matter. Maybe you have a budget summary or some sort of cover page that only applies to a certain corporate identity, so that's why you would choose a certain corporate identity here. But most of the time, you could just say none. It doesn't really matter which corporate identity you're using. You just always want this report to go. Same exact idea with location. If you have multiple business locations, then you could choose which location is enabled to run this report. So again, what this means, if I'm on a quote and I choose a certain business location or warehouse that this quote is coming out of, and that's required, you have to do that to get availability and things like that. So for example, this particular quote is coming out of my Salt Lake City warehouse. So what that means in the default print format report section is that if I choose my Orem or Denver warehouse, then this budget summary agreement would only print if I have Denver chosen on my quote. So again, I can choose a filter, but a lot of times you'll just leave that open to all locations because it doesn't matter which location you've chosen, you just always want this report to run. But you see what that means if you do have a certain restriction where you only want a certain report to run for a certain location, you could choose that there. Now the sub-report has to do with if you're running an aggregation report. You wouldn't necessarily run an aggregation report from a single quote. You would, however, run an aggregation report from something like an event folder. So what if I had an event folder that had 5 different quotes underneath it? I might want to run the quote sub-report aggregation from the event folder so that it would print each and every quote that's inside of that event folder. And what this setting means is that if I were to choose a report that's an aggregation report, then I would have to choose a sub-report, meaning which look do I want to use for that aggregation of reports. Let me show you just a quick example of that. If we go back to our project element settings page and let's open our event folder. It's kind of the same idea here. We can go to the reports tab and look at the default print format report. So when I hit generate PDF from an event folder, it's going to print budget summary agreement look D. Then it's going to run the sub-report aggregation for quotes. It's going to print every quote, and I chose quote with pricing look B as the sub-report or as the look that each quote in that event folder is going to take. So that's what that sub-report means. I just wanted to show you that so you understand what it means, but you will most likely not be using it as you're setting up your default print format report on the quote, because you typically aren't running an aggregation report from a single quote. So a lot of times when I'm doing this, I'll only choose a single report. I don't necessarily choose a corporate identity, location, or a sub-report. I just say, I want budget summary agreement look A to run, and then I click add, and that adds it to my list of things that will be included in the PDF stack when I hit generate PDF. So I don't just want the summary and agreement, I also want to run one of my quote looks. And I could do one of two things. I could run just the default financial document. I could run one of these, I could run one of the pre-designed looks, quote with pricing look A. But once I choose which look of a quote I want to run, I just choose it and then click add. And notice that adds it to the list as well. And then what I see a lot of our customers do as a best practice is also include maybe a terms and conditions to that as well. So maybe I'll just choose the default terms and conditions and add that to my PDF stack as well. So again, whatever I set up in this section is what will print when I'm on a quote and click Generate PDF. Now, I haven't updated this yet. That's really important. Just because I added them to this list doesn't mean that anything got saved yet. I always have to come down here and click Update on the quote settings. Additionally, if I changed my mind, I could remove one just by clicking the X over here. I could even move these around. Let's say that maybe I want the terms and conditions before the actual quote look. It's just a drag and drop. Really easy process to move those around. But after any changes, just make sure you click Update. So let's go see what this looks like. Because I set this up in my quote project element settings, let's go back to our quote. Click Generate PDF. And when I click Generate Report, this is going to give me that I created. So here's page 1. Let me make it just a little bit bigger so we can see it better. But here's page 1 with the budget summary agreement. Page 2 with the actual quote attached. Page 3 with the terms and conditions. And it looks like the terms and conditions are typically going to be pulled from whatever business location settings you're using. And it looks like I just don't have terms and conditions set up for my Salt Lake City warehouse, so that's why nothing shows up here. But if you do have something uploaded for terms and conditions in your business location or in your corporate identity, then that would show up on this page. But you can see what happened there. I've got 3 pages now that generated as a single PDF because I set that up in my default print format report. So you can get really creative with this, and we'll look at some more best practices in the upcoming weeks for this series of reports best practices, where you can actually upload static reports and include something that you designed in this stack of reports. And there's a few other things that you can do with this as well. Before we move on to anything else, I do just want to quickly talk about the difference between the types of reports that you can run. There are 2 different types of reports. We have what we call a dynamic report, and then we have a static report. Static reports would just be something that you can upload into your system that is pre-designed, that doesn't necessarily take any information from Flex. This might be like a pretty looking cover page or something like that. Your dynamic reports are going to be these instance level reports and things like that that are pre-designed but have codes embedded into the design that's pulling information from Flex. So no matter where you run it from, it will dynamically take the information from the quote. Now within those dynamic reports, there's also another subcategory of reports where we have some reports that are pre-designed with a certain look and feel that will always look that way. So most of these that are called like quote look A, quote looks, all of those are pre-designed, and what that means is that they're pretty much always going to look like this. The only difference being that the names of certain things will change. Now the default financial document, this one works a little bit different. This isn't necessarily a pre-designed report that always looks the same and just changes the information based on the quote. The default financial document is actually a report that will look at the way that your quote is designed. So it'll look at your columns in the header block and in your details, and it will actually replicate however you have your quote set up. So let me show you what this looks like compared to some of these other pre-designed reports. If I click Default Financial Document, notice what I get compared to this quote with pricing. I think this was look B or D. But notice the differences here with the default financial document. It pretty much took exactly what I had set up in the header block. It took exactly what I have set up in my detail column, and it created a PDF report out of that. Now that doesn't happen with these pre-designed looks like the quote with pricing look A and quote images and those kind of reports. I could add new columns to my header block. I could remove columns from my detail block, make some things appear or not appear, and this is always going to look the same. Whereas the default financial document will change based on what I add or remove. So let's look at that, and we'll probably cover this in greater detail in our next week. We'll talk more about how you can change the look and feel of your quote to change how that default financial document looks, but let's at least cover a few basics in the time that we have here. So again, we're going to go back to Projects, Project Elements, double-click Quote. And this time we're going to look at our document views. So the document views are going to be the different tabs that you have along the top of a quote. So if we go back to this quote, we have Working View, Logistics View, Profit Markup, Change View, etc. Each of these views has a different look and feel, and you can put different information on there based on what information you want to be able to see. So if we go back to our project element settings, here are all the settings for the working view, the logistics view, profit markup, etc. So I just have to double click on a view, and that gives me all the different options for that view. So for my working view, I want to look at my header block columns. These are all of the things that I set up in my header block. So let's say, for example, I don't really need this replacement cost or client insurance anymore. I'll just click X to remove those. Click Update, and then I have to click Update again to save all of the settings for the quote. So Update to close the window, click Update again to save all your changes. But if I go back and refresh or reload my quote now, you'll notice that I don't have the replacement cost or client insurance info there anymore. And then when I click Default Financial Document, that information doesn't print on the PDF. Remember how it did before, but now it doesn't. So that's the main difference between all these other different looks and the default financial document. Is the default financial document will basically follow however you've set up your quote look, and it will print that. This also applies to whatever view you're on. So if I'm sitting on the logistics view and click Default Financial Document, it's going to print out the logistics view. So we won't go through all of the settings in your document views in this webinar just for time's sake, but next week we will talk a little bit more about some best practices and how you could really design a certain view to look and feel a certain way, and then just use that default financial document to get a report to look the way that you want it. So we'll look at that in the next week of this series. But you can start to see how that could be a huge benefit to you, because normally if you want one of these custom looks, then you'll have to email Flex Support. They'll give you a quote of how long it might take and how much money it would cost to be able to design that report. And it might cost you several $100s to get the report look that you want. But if you're fine with just using the default financial document, then you could design the way that you want it to look, just write it in Flex, and then just print the default financial document. So we'll look at some of that in the next week. So that pretty much covers the basics of your instance level reports. Just to show you, let's go back to our project elements and maybe look at our pull sheets. Remember, each element can have its own instance level reports enabled or disabled so that you can run those reports from that element. So if we go to the Reports tab for a pull sheet, you'll notice there aren't quite as many things checked. None of those quote looks, in fact, most of them aren't even enabled to be available from a pull sheet. And then I also did the same thing for my default print format report. So when I'm on a pull sheet and I click Generate PDF, it's going to print the default equipment list first, and then it's going to print this custom checklist report that I created. So you can do that for each of your elements. I could go into my manifest, do the same thing, click the Reports tab, enable different instance level reports, change what happens when I click Generate PDF in this default print format report. And this is a good one. I have first it prints the shipping manifest, then a truck pack list, and then the safe work method statement. I did a webinar on the safe work methods a couple weeks ago. If you're interested in what that is, you can find that video online. But again, a vastly different set of enabled instance level reports for the manifest versus the pull sheet. One last thing I'll mention before we finish. The Send to Client option. This is going to send exactly what sends when you click Generate PDF. So for example, because I went into my quote settings and I set the default print format report to print this when I click Generate PDF, when I use the Send to Client option to send this out to whoever the client is, it's going to attach to the email exactly what prints when you do Generate PDF. So I always offer that as kind of a word of warning. If you're going to experiment with the default print format report and change what happens when you click Generate PDF, just keep in mind that if you have other people in your system who are using Send to Client, they're going to have attached to the Send to Client email whatever prints when you do Generate PDF. So if you're experimenting with that, make sure everyone in your company knows, or that you aren't using the Send to Client option during that time when you're experimenting with it. So again, today we were just covering a lot of the basics with instance level reports. In the next week, and we won't have a webinar next week just because of the holiday, but in the next week of this series, whenever that is, probably just at the beginning of the new year, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the deeper options that you can get into with document views so that you could change the way that your default financial document looks. And then we'll also look at that idea of uploading some static reports that you can add to your stack PDF here. And we'll also look at some things like report preferences and a few things like that. In the weeks after that, we'll look at some best practices that we've seen other customers use when setting up their reports, and just some really, really good examples of reports that we've seen and people using in their system. And then we'll briefly touch on custom reports, not only how you can request your own custom reports, but we'll also talk a little bit about how you could try your hand at designing your own custom reports and then uploading them into your system so that you can bypass needing to go through us and spending money on a custom report if you could just do it yourself. So if you have any questions about some of the basics that we've talked about today about instance level reports, then please email support@flexrentalsolutions.com.